Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Colin Teevan's play Kafka's Monkey, which is an adaptation of Franz Kafka's short story, A Report to an Academy. This is really cool. So the actual text itself of Teevan's script really doesn't diverge much from Kafka's short story. There are a few places where it does in minor ways, but for the most part, Teevan has taken the text of Kafka's story and put it into verse. Now, this is an interesting one from a performance perspective because there are moments in which the layout of the text as verse changes, and this opens up interesting possibilities for a performer, right? So much of the text, for instance, is formatted like this, basically sort of double-spaced, straight down the page, left-hand margin aligned text. But there are also moments or scenes set up differently. So this is scene 4, right? The structure of that text on the page is different. And this is a moment in which Red Peter, who is the only speaker here, as he is in Kafka's short story, is talking about having been captured and put into a cage on this ship. After these two shots, normally aligned, I came to myself is well indented. And again, we've got these sort of these extra spaces between the lines. This is where my memory gradually begins. Below decks, on the Hagenbeck steamer, inside a cage, not a 4-sided barred cage, but a 3-sided cage nailed to the ship's wall. And then we get this bit here, right? So within scene 4, we have this section that shifts back to that standardized layout of basically double-spaced, left-hand margin aligned. And this is a point. This method of caging wild beasts is in the first days of captivity is, from a human point of view, supposed to have advantages, and in light of my experiences, I can't deny from a human point of view that this is true. But I did not have that point of view then. All I could see was, for the first time in my life, was that there was. So that portion, that sort of human reflection on the experience, on Red Peter's experience being caged. By the way, in case you didn't watch my video on Kafka's short story, which I linked earlier in the cards and whatnot, the premise of A Report to an Academy is Red Peter is an ape of some kind, possibly a chimpanzee, though that's not 100%. Then Kafka never establishes for sure. But there was a performing chimp named Peter who does get mentioned in the short story and consequently in Teevan's play. And so it's possible that is sort of meant to point us in the direction of Red Peter's specific species, but it doesn't really matter. Nonetheless, Red Peter is an ape of some kind who, through a sort of act of will in an attempt to escape a life in captivity, has intellectually transformed himself into a human being, having reached, as he says, the level of culture of an average European. And so what we get in this portion of scene 4 is a shift from Red Peter's experience as an ape in captivity to Red Peter as a human, because that is more or less how Red Peter now identifies. So Red Peter's experience as a human looking back analytically on why what was done was done. And on the page, it is set up differently. The experience of being in captivity and of feeling trapped, feeling that there is, as Red Peter will repeatedly say, no way out. And these three words are consistently formatted like this. That has these much broader spaces, this much more broken approach to formatting on the page, whereas the reflective component from the contemporary Red Peter, from his perspective today, that is much more, that's much cleaner, much more consistent, much more regular, and even physically closer on the page. And so the layout of the text itself suggests these emotional changes. Now, what's cool and interesting about that from a performer's perspective is, what do you do with that? Right? So I would almost compare this a little bit to performing Shakespeare, because some people, when they perform Shakespeare, they very much go with the read based on punctuation, not based on line breaks technique. And I think that's now more or less the standard approach to Shakespearean performance, right? So Shakespearean verse tends to be in what's called blank verse, which means the lines themselves are iambic pentameter, but you do not always, a line doesn't always end with a piece of punctuation, right? Sometimes the thought continues onto the next line. So you read based on the punctuation. You perform based on the punctuation. With this script, do you perform based on the punctuation? Or do you perform based on the layout of the text? And what difference does it make if you choose one or the other? So, for instance, if we go back to the start of 4 and just take the first 2 lines, after these shots, I came to myself, right? So again, the way that those are laid out on the page, we have this gap between them. Do you perform the gap? So on the one hand, you can read this based on the punctuation. After these 2 shots, I came to myself. Right? Make it one sentence that flows as one sentence. Or you can read this based on the punctuation and give us a break in it. After these 2 shots, I came to myself. And those are very different performance choices, and they mean something different for a listening audience. What they do is very different for performance. And it raises, it's one of these things, again, where as a performer or as a director, whoever it is that's making the artistic choices about this, you have to decide what you want to do and why, what effect you want to achieve with the way that you perform it. So that's one really, really cool aspect of this play. The other one that I think is really interesting takes us back to the very beginning. So the opening of the play, and the opening of the short story. Same basic text. Esteemed members of the Academy, you've done me the great honor of inviting me to give an account of my former life as an ape. I regret that I cannot comply with your request, at least to the extent you might desire. Now, there's more to it than that, obviously. Red Peter gives an explanation of why he can't comply. But this is super important as a difference, a transmedial adaptation difference. So what I mean by that, transmedial adaptation is where you move a story or a text or whatever it is from one medium, in this case short story or fiction or prose, to another medium, in this case theatrical performance. So you shift from one medium to another. And these different media have different resources and constraints, things they can do, things they can't do, things they excel at, things they struggle at, etc., etc. That's a big part of adaptation studies, and it's a very contested part of adaptation studies, particularly the premise that certain media are capable or incapable of certain things, and I don't want to get too far into that. But what I do want to get into is this idea of esteemed members of the Academy. You've done me the great honor of inviting me. Because this hits differently in performance than it does in prose, right? So when we're reading Kafka's short story, we as readers do not have to put ourselves in the position of the members of the Academy, right? We can imagine ourselves at a remove from this, that we are watching Red Peter give a report to the members of the Academy, that we are watching this occur. With the theatrical performance, when Red Peter says, esteemed members of the Academy, he's talking to us. Now, I, of course, am reading this, so I get that, I can have that same sort of prose style alienation from this, but as a theater audience, Red Peter comes out and puts you in the position of being a member of the Academy, of being the person or one of the people, rather, who has requested this report. And that raises interesting questions because it implicitly asks us to consider what it is that we actually want from the performance, right? So what Red Peter says in the story and in the play is, you've done me the great honor of inviting me to give an account of my former life as an ape. Now, for the Red Peter of the short story, this is perfectly fine. On one level, we'll come back to that, put a pin in it. This is perfectly fine, right? Red Peter is an ape who has turned into a human, right? Cool, good enough. We, in our brains, can accept that as a construct of the fictional world that Kafka is creating. But when we go to see Teevan's play, we aren't seeing it. And we know that we're not seeing it, right? We know that we are not seeing an ape who has turned himself into a man. We are seeing a human being who is performing as an ape who has turned himself into a man. And strikingly, in the original performance run at the Young Vic, Catherine Hunter played Red Peter. So we are seeing a female performer who is performing as a male ape who has turned himself into a man. So we have that additional level of sort of alienation between the performing body and the character being presented, right? So this is interesting. One of the biggest sort of issues within theater studies, within performance studies, is, of course, the relationship between the body of the performer and the character being performed. And there's tons of different perspectives, tons of different issues that come up with this. But in this case, what we have is a clear alienation, right? We clearly have a character who is talking about their transition from one thing to a different thing. And we can agree or disagree about the actual nature of that transition, right? Whether or not Red Peter is an ape or a human or whatever, we can have that debate if you want to. But clearly, Red Peter conceptualizes himself as having transitioned from an ape to a human. Good enough. Catherine Hunter does not conceptualize herself as having transitioned from a male ape to a male human. She is an actor, right? A female actor who conceptualizes herself as such. She's incredibly talented. And so she can perform this role really, really convincingly. I've seen bits and pieces of the performance through watching trailers and stuff right here on the YouTube machine. But we have that alienation, and that alienation on the stage is harder to ignore because we have the physical body of the performer. And so we can see that this is not a male ape who has transformed himself into a human. We can see that this is a human, a female human, performing as a male ape who has transitioned himself into a human. And so we can't we're not sort of free to we can willingly suspend our disbelief, right? This is a major construct in theater. This is a thing that people rely on in theater, and I've done it as well in performance, in directing, etc., etc. The willing suspension of disbelief. Cool. Good enough. But we nonetheless have before our eyes the very evidence that we do not have Red Peter as such. The gap between what the character says they are and what the actor's physical body is a living, embodied reminder of that alienation, that distance between actor and character. Now, this is cool because it actually reflects back to Kafka's short story in that with fiction, with prose, it's much easier to ignore this, but the reality with Kafka's short story is that we do not have the words of an ape who has transitioned into a man. We have the words of a human being, Franz Kafka, who has written from the perspective of what he imagines an ape turning into a human would be like. So we have that alienation again, that distance between the actual author of the words and the persona of the character speaking the words. And so we have that gap. And again, in prose, in fiction, it's much easier to ignore the implications of that because we can imagine. We know that this is fiction, right? And so we can imagine that this is the words of Red Peter as such, and we do not have that immediate, visible mediation of Franz Kafka's actual body as human being in a way that we do with the stage play. We have Catherine Hunter's actual physical body as a human being with its physiological differences from that of Red Peter, right? Both in terms of gender and in terms of species. And so we've got that alienation is highlighted by the physical presence of the actor in a way it is not highlighted by the physical absence of the author in the short story.